Hey family, thank you for tuning into Our Roots podcast with Joseph Baba Ifa, where only the strongest roots see the light, brought to you by 𝗿𝗲𝗿𝗍 Candles and more. And if you haven't had the opportunity, please tap on that subscribe button. Very exciting episode today, Ifa and Psychology. And our guest is a special one, and she is a transpersonal psychotherapist with academic credentials to be able to support all of the things we're going to be discussing today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rebecca Rojas.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Dr. Rojas, needless to say, we're as enthused. You know, when we're talking about Our Roots podcast and what our goals are here is to put that professional and academic face to the practitioner of Ifa and that preparation. So to have someone such as yourself with your credentials is exciting to say the least. And I really want to give the opportunity for you to delve into the history of your preparation and you know, the schooling that you've been through to, you know, edify you as we delve into this conversation.
So as far as my credentials, I have a master's in mental health counseling, and then I have a doctorate in psychology with a specialization in transpersonal psychology and psychosis. And transpersonal psychology is just a fancy way of saying, studying, spirituality, altered states of consciousness, phenomena that's not so quite so easy to measure, like the actual brain or, biological sciences. So kind of in the realm of this area. And I know that we had been in touch about a year ago when I was writing my dissertation on this very topic. So my dissertation was on, describing the mind from Santeria practitioners' perspective and trying to put that into psychological terms.
Absolutely. And congratulations on attaining that level of PhD. I could imagine the amount of sacrifice it takes to get there, but you look like you're still in one piece. So we're still able
I,
to get some work done moving forward.
I
Um,
know a couple gray hairs, but I'm here.
absolutely. And if I'm not mistaken, you're located in Miami, Florida, correct?
I am, yes, yes.
Awesome. And like we were just discussing, lifelong resident. You know, such as myself, I was born there as well. And, you know, for people who aren't familiar with Miami, you know, it's kind of hard to understand the dynamic, but when you're from it and you're in it, you know, you see this kind of culture everywhere you turn. There's a 𝗿𝗲𝗿𝗍𝗶, there's somebody with a bracelet on, etc. So, you know, when did you first hear about Santeria originally?
Oh gosh. Well, like you said, growing up in Miami, it's kind of hard not to hear about it because
Right.
I wasn't raised in the faith, but you know somebody who knows somebody who practices the religion, and it's very taboo, especially if your family doesn't practice the religion. Um, Interestingly enough, Santeria is actually what brought me to psychology because as a kid,
Wow.
as a teenager, right? I was really interested in psychology, but I could never see myself practicing in the field. I don't know too many people who in high school are like super clear about what they want to do, professionally. Um, but I became involved with the religion around 2007. I was in the religion for many years before I got involved. But I went back to school. The point where I decided that this was worth studying together was once I got my master's degree and I started working in the field, and I started seeing so many patients from the Caribbean who had these belief systems and how the psychological field was kind of failing them. They weren't really receptive to the needs of this community. And something else that I thought was super interesting is that patients who practice this religion seem to be faring better than other patients who were having similar symptoms and didn't have this support. So I thought that was super fascinating. I thought this is something we should be studying a little bit deeper because for us to provide better care to them and also learn what are they receiving in their community that's helping them that other areas of the population are not receiving that support.
Wow, that's very progressive and probably the most progressive outlook I've heard from any medical professional I've interacted with, other than those that, you know, are in my own spiritual house, right? Because I have had the pleasure of, you know, initiating a psychiatrist as a 𝗿𝗲𝗍𝗶, and a couple other people in the medical field. But you know, me being somebody that's very I was blessed with a college education for the most part. pretty logical in my assertion of things. And, I've never used Ifa as an excuse for things, right? Because, when we're of Afro-Caribbean descent, sometimes spirituality might be used to be able to replace the acknowledgement of I have other things going on that I need to address in a more, formal medical way, right? But I,
Absolutely.
yeah, and I can say that there have been times though when I've been able to look and be like, well, based on what the oracle is saying, without any ulterior intentions, there is something spiritual here that needs to be addressed before we can do a further, diagnosis, right? And like we were saying before, we even started recording, the dynamic here is very different, where you're somebody that's very progressive, apart from being an initiate and so educated. In Cuba, you would see this very frequently as well, where a lot of the medical professionals, whether it was mental, more invasive, they were initiated, and when they would go through their analysis and say, hey, there isn't anything medical happening here, you may need to see 𝗹𝗶𝗹𝗶. And I'd love it if you reference what you mentioned, how in other communities and countries you have that, that collaboration, because you were saying there's scenarios where you'll have a psychologist, psychiatrist, and even a spiritual professional. If you could delve into that.
Yeah, I was really shocked when I was doing my dissertation. Part of the process is you need to do a literature review and go over, what material is out there. And some of the studies that I came across was like in Brazil or Puerto Rico, there's centers that have, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and a spiritual professional there. So that the patient is covering all bases, which I thought was fascinating. And that those patients, again, tended to do better because they felt that their cultural framework was being respected. Because look, I mean, you can have schizophrenia or bipolar and still be having a spiritual experience. One
Wow.
doesn't take away from the other. The same way that not all spiritual experiences are that. Maybe sometimes there's somebody who thinks they're having a spiritual experience and it's really a psychiatric issue. But there's several cases that I've come across of people that are being diagnosed with psychiatric conditions that my impression is that it's more in spiritual in nature than it is psychiatric. So having a comprehensive team that everybody brings their expertise, the psychological, the psychiatric, and the spiritual. I think that's only going to help, provide the best level of care to the patient.
Yeah, definitely. And even in, you know, so-called third world countries, for some people's opinion, we're still able to have that level of care where we are focusing much more on the patient than any other motivations that might be interrupting that kind of care, right? So, seeing how other systems utilize everything they can to help the patient, do you have that at your disposal here where you're able to formally recommend a spiritual professional within that context of a session? Can you recommend somebody to a 𝗶𝗶𝗹 or a 𝗶𝗶𝗹𝗁, legally?
So yeah, so legally it's kind of a gray area, right? There's no specific law prohibiting me from doing so. Maybe a little there's an ethical dilemma there. But again, it's a gray area because for psychologists or psychotherapists, the whole idea is that we need to make decisions based on evidence-based practice. Whatever decision I make for a patient, there needs to be some kind of scientific backing that it's going to benefit the patient. They don't recommend that we start engaging in experimental practices that have the potential to hurt the patient. In cases where I feel that it would be beneficial, there is research out there backing, supporting the idea that, ritualistic like psychodrama or, taking into consideration and working with the patient's culture can be beneficial to them. So while I wouldn't like go out of my way to suggest to a patient, hey, you sound like you're having a spiritual problem, go see a babalao. If they open the door by mentioning to me, hey, I'm thinking this might be spiritual. What do you think? I try to be as supportive as possible, but I kinda let them open the door first rather than me to be the one to suggest it, 'cause we live in a very litigious society, so I'm hesitant to suggest it out of the blue.
No, definitely. And just you being open and minded enough to even consider it, even with them opening the door, is once again very rare, right? And I don't think our viewers, most of them, have had the opportunity to see somebody in your position be able to acknowledge that publicly. So, so much kudos to you. And whatever we do on the podcast, we always try to corroborate it on our end with a pataki or a story that really backs up the concept, as to why. Because we go through the same thing. Some people, come up in the house and they're like, oye, I have a muerto. This guy's
Mhm.
doing brujeria to me. Don't tell me it's nothing else, Oluo. I'm like, all right, let's throw the chain, right? But
Mhm.
there is actually a pataki or a story where this occurred, where someone came to visit Orula and they said, I'm having a spiritual issue, right? So when they were having this issue, the Odu of 𝗶𝗸𝗶𝗍 was revealed, where Ifa was literally telling Orula to tell the client, you need to see someone that could help you emotionally and mentally, right? Because there is nothing spiritual happening here. Now, mind you, ethics is always what's brought into question because, you know, you have some people who wholeheartedly will say, hey, you need to go see somebody like a psychotherapist, right?
Mhm.
But you have others that might not for whatever ulterior reasons. But the most important thing is that you have the confidence you've done everything you have for the patient. So that's a very specific pataki that says we go through the same thing sometimes. You know, we actually get frowned upon by some patients or clients, better said, in our practice that are like, don't send me to a doctor, you know, for whatever reason it may be. So we go through the same thing over here. Um, Now you've said this, but do you have you had any cases like that where people have kind of opened up and said, you know, I am going through something spiritual, or even more so, has anyone ever come into trance during a session, you know, without delving into, you know, privacy, of course?
Well, so as far as going into trance, I haven't witnessed that in session. I have seen people like in active psychosis, like going through a crisis, which can be kind of similar, more maybe less controlled than in a trance. Um, as far as people approaching me and telling me that they're going through something spiritual and they want advice, it happens quite frequently. I think the fact I advertise myself again as a transpersonal psychotherapist, so people are already aware that I'm open to these kind of things. So I'm hoping that that is part of the reason why they're so open to share these things with me. But I'll give you an example. Recently, I had a client. He's Jewish. He's hears voices. He came and he told me, look, the therapy is working really well, but I want to kind of explore the possibility that this might be a spiritual thing. My family has suggested that I look into an exorcism. What are your thoughts on that? And to that I responded, I said, look, I don't know too much about how Judaism handles exorcism. I support it. I think that this can be beneficial. Again, that psychodrama aspect of it. But like I said, it's important to find somebody who's qualified to do those kind of things because unfortunately, there are a lot of charlatans in these kind of professions. Um, Interestingly enough, I did recommend to him. I said, "Look, I don't know anything about Judaic exorcism, but I do know about Allah who can perform a paraldo ceremony if you're open to that." And
Yeah.
he was. So I linked him up with the person that I knew and trusted, and so yeah, there have been situations where they open the door, and I'm more than happy to try to work within their spiritual framework.
And I've noticed that these things really occur with people who come from ethnicities that are very spiritually in tuned. When we're talking about Ifa, one of the oldest spiritual practices on earth, there were a couple other groups that were there with us, you know, in that era. You know, Hinduism was there,
Mhm.
Shintoism, you know, the nature based worship in Japan was there, and Judaism as well. You know, my family is from Brooklyn, and I had an aunt that lived in Williamsburg, which is like one of the meccas of Jewish culture in the city. And you'd frequently see the Hasidic population, rabbis performing rituals on the corner, whether it was cleansing, sacrifices, very similar to us. There's also famous cases of Jewish individuals actually getting initiated in Orisha, you know, so it makes a lot of sense why this person might be experiencing that because they have very, even with Kabbalah and things like that, they
Mhm.
have very profound and are very spiritually in tuned. But I noticed that whether it's with them, whether it's with us that are Afro-Caribbean descendant, this is usually the demographic that experiences these kind of things, right? In your experience, have you been able to notice the same, that there is a high volume of people within this demographic that, you know, go through this spiritual phenomena?
Absolutely. I mean, maybe I'm biased because again, living here in Miami, the predominantly my clients are people from the Caribbean. But I'm a firm believer that spiritual experience is unique to all people, regardless of what your background is. Because I mean, I have had a pretty diverse group of people come into my office. I mean, I had one client who was from England. Okay, so you couldn't get any further away from, he had no
Sure.
connection to the Caribbean or to Africa or anything like that, And he mentioned to me that when he was 19, I think he went to Puerto Rico and he had this spontaneous spiritual experience where he got like what he felt was like a possession by a spirit that opened up this whole interest in that spirituality. By the time he came to see me, he was in his like late 50s, but he told me he went to Peru and became an ordained shaman. And so I feel like yes, maybe certain groups of people are more connected with these beliefs, but I'm a firm believer that anybody from any background can, when they least expect it, have these again very transpersonal experiences.
Well, when we look at something as, non-denominational as the soul, Ifa
Hmm.
is recognized as the spirituality of mankind, where, yes, initially it was associated with melanated people because that's what was present at the dawn of time. That was that defense mechanism and what ensured survival. But as we interacted, as we procreated, we don't know what our spiritual makeup may be these many, thousands, if not millions of years later, where, seemingly said British gentleman has no connection to Africa whatsoever, but he might have said ancestor, or maybe his ancestor interacted with somebody in a past life, and then we have this phenomenon. Because I've literally dealt with it, being online and seeing all the different demographics of people that have been initiated in Ifa. There's Japanese babalaos,
Hmm.
British babalaos that I'm in communication with, and they're practicing very well and they're receiving a lot of benefits from it. Trance is a big topic, right? Because it is something that happens frequently within the community.
Hmm.
Not everybody has this gift, as we like to view it. Me being a babalawo, within the Lukumí tradition, our theology says I don't have the molecule to be able to, come into trance with a spirit or an Orisha. Um, what what are studies saying about trance? Like, is it legitimate? Is there phenomenon? Is there studies? Is there a certain part of the brain? If you could delve into that concept with us.
So trance, it's an interesting concept, right? Because we're talking here about altered states of consciousness, whether it's happening on its own, or the person is initiating it, or they're taking some kind of substance to get themselves into that trance. As far as parts of the brain that are being activated, based on studies that have been done, the parts of the brain that are being activated are the parts of the brain that process sensory experiences. So sensory being the five senses: your sight, your smell, your hearing, taste. Um, which is not surprising because the impression I get, at least from my experiences with this religion, is that sensory experience is a big part of kind of opening up those channels within the mind to make these states accessible, let's say. Because when you go to un tambor and people enter into these trance states, or you go to una misa espiritual and the person is chanting and praying, all of these sensory stimulation seems to be a big part of entering into those trance states. Even going further, like, let's say non-organic trance states, like when in the case where somebody takes a substance like DMT or ayahuasca and things like that, there's studies too, again, about this suggestion that the pineal gland is believed to possibly produce these substances that are meant to put us into these trance states, which makes you think like, why does this organ exist in the brain if it's part of our genetic makeup, it seems like, to have these experiences. It's very, very fascinating to explore again, why is this even something that humans are experiencing in the first place?
Wow. It's kind of like the wisdom tooth of the brain, right? It's there. It's from the past. We don't use it as much. Maybe we should. Maybe we're neglecting it, right?
Right, it
Um,
seems like maybe more primitive man had contact with it, and as we become more civilized, we've moved further and further away from our spirituality, which is interesting because Carl Jung, the psychologist who I kind of use, base my practice on, he talked a lot about, the collective unconscious, this idea that we have these like ancient memories from mankind, and he says, if you want to get closer to God, try to go back as close as you can to the beginning of mankind, because the further we kept growing, the more civilized we became, the further away we moved away from God. So the more you can get to that core, again, go where did civilization mankind start from? Africa. So this is like, in my idea, this is like the purest version of religion that hasn't been corrupted with, symbols or, other kind of mechanisms.
Carl Jung, I mean, if I recall, he was somebody that identified archetypes as well, correct, doctor?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, I remember, in my brief collegiate education, being able to interact with his literature, seeing, the things that he was expressing. Mind you, in my freshman year in college, I was actually in my 𝗃𝗷𝗿𝗲𝗃. I was going through my year in white, right?
Oh, wow.
So when I'm taking my humanities class, or I even took an elective of mythology, because I'm like, somehow I gotta kind of bring this back into what I'm trying to study. I was realizing that these basic concepts, they actually transcend any denomination of faith, right? Whether it's Santeria, whether it's numerology, whatever. There's this symbolism. The number seven means this in every culture,
Mhm.
or this archetype, like the Hermes Eshu archetype. It's present everywhere. And it lets you know there's a commonality between us as far as ancestry, like Mr. Young or you're stating right now. So it seems like you've seen that as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's why I feel like no matter what the person's cultural background is, and like you mentioned, the British gentleman, we still share a shared humanity, a human history there. That if you go back far enough, we all come from the same source. So yeah, our religions might manifest in different ways, but at the end of the day, my understanding of religion, anyways, is it's a mankind trying to make sense of all these phenomena that they're experiencing. It came, again, in India, it was, viewed as one way in Christian cultures and Judaic and Ifa, but it's all trying to explain at the end of the day that same source.
Absolutely. And, the fact that you bring up the sensory aspect of trance is really intriguing to me because my wife, she is an 𝗃𝗲𝗿𝗃, or this is the term to utilize somebody who comes into trance of her Orisha, right? Which is Oshun. And me not being able to experience this phenomenon, I've asked her, we've had many conversations like, honey, what are you feeling? And she likes to call it the champagne theory, right? Because when we talk about Afro-Indigenous faiths, everything ultimately is earth and nature worship, right? So it's this energy that ultimately begins in the feet. And she says it's literally like this rising temperature through the body until there's like this pop cork thing that happens, and then she completely blacks out. But it's interesting you mentioned the sensory aspect because sight is gone. You lose control. You somewhat go numb. It's a completely, and she says in the beginning, she would liken it to, obviously she hasn't gone through the process, but she would liken it to death because she's like,
Mhm.
I'm on my way out. Have what the people that you've been able to interact with that have gone through this phenomenon, what kind of symptoms have they been able to explain to you?
So from what I understand, they don't lose consciousness. They just kind of shift over. If we look at the mind as like the conscious and the unconscious mind, even if the lights go out, the person is still aware of what's going on, especially in those trance states. So it sounds like again, it's maybe them stepping away from the more conscious part of the mind and stepping more into that like collective space where these spiritual phenomena are occurring. That part of what I wrote about in my dissertation was like dividing up of the mind, that there's the personal mind, the conscious part of the mind, then there's the collective part of the mind where that's where the orishas, the egun, el astral, all that exists. So when a person goes into that state, they're stepping out of the personal and back into the collective again.
Wow. So definitely a more digestible form of being understand what that out of body really means metaphorically. Like I've left myself and kind of delved into that, which is more open and available to those around me. So interesting stuff, definitely. Now, as far as the studies on trance that you've mentioned, have there been any positive effects recognized after trance?
So it does seem to have some healing benefits. I don't know that they've done too many studies specifically on like spiritual trance, but I'll use the example of trance in the case of like psychedelics, let's say like psilocybin, because there has been a lot of research done on that. When a person does those kind of drugs, nothing is really happening on a physical level. It's more psychological because of them being in these states and looking at things from different perspectives. New neural pathways are being built as a result. So somebody who's having a really hard time coping with depression or grief because of their current way of looking at things, stepping back into that collective space allows them to see things differently. So yes, there is a lot of benefit of being able maybe to step away from the ego and come back to the collective. I guess maybe that would be the best way of describing it. So yeah, definitely. there's benefit, but there's also risk, right? Because you also have people that have a difficult time coming back out of that state, back into the ego, back into the personal consciousness.
Well, there's actually an Odu that touches on this within my own sign of 𝗃𝗏𝗿𝗄𝗃, and it speaks of a pataki where there was a young man who wanted to ride the back of the vulture into the realm of Olodumare because he was seeking enlightenment. He was seeking knowledge and wisdom far beyond what could be encompassed in, a human brain, right? And
Mhm.
knowing myself, I must say I'm quite studious within my practice because I'm just passionate about it, right? But Olodumare advised him, he said, there's certain things we're not meant to tap into, even within our own body. Not everything is meant to be an experience. But, being impetuous and young in this specific Badagi, the man forced the vulture to take him to heaven. But the vulture, as it flew higher and higher and higher, couldn't handle the weight, the atmospheric pressure, etc., whatever you want to, chalk it up to, and dropped the guy. And the guy went from this altered state of consciousness right back to earth, but it was not a comfortable, impact, and he busted his head open for lack of
Mhm.
terms. What could be those negative effects? Because now there's this huge thing now, so many podcasts, so many alternative things coming out, DMT, ayahuasca, all of these different things. What could be some of the negative effects of overindulging or even simply indulging in these things if misadministered?
Well, definitely the first thing that comes to mind is psychosis, right?
Mm.
Because I'll even say, like, look, I mean, the most extreme cases is usually drug induced, but I've heard of, you mentioned about your wife, that sensation of starting at her feet and feeling like the cork popping at the top. That sounds like Kundalini psychosis too, which is a phenomena of people who are practicing very vigorously, like yoga and meditation. There's a danger there too. Like, I don't think people recognize that these are not just like stretching and like influencer things. Like, these are spiritual practices that they can be very beautiful and very powerful, but you need to treat them with respect, right? At the end of the day, it's a tool, and if you don't respect it, it can. If you delve too heavy into it, it can have, again, an explosive effect. Again, just not being prepared for the aftermath of that. I mean, I think anybody who has had a spiritual experience and hasn't had somebody to support them through it, whether it's a madrina or padrino or somebody, that is the person who's probably most at risk of finding it very challenging to integrate those situations and having a hard time telling, what's that reality versus what's the waking reality. And that in clinically that would be considered psychosis.
Yeah, and and with the conversations that I've had with my wife, her being initiated in Oshun now well over 10 years, she's actually quite allergic to the drummings just because of that. She's like, I love my guardian Orisha. There is a lot of energy there, and I'm going to delve into the aspect of the drum now and kind of the effects
Mhm.
it has on us. And she's like, I'm not trying to overstimulate that. And it's ironic you say that because to tap in with that much intensity that lets you know, even though she has come down fully, it's
Mhm.
something that if you have that gift, you're constantly working at it, aligning yourself with your Orisha and refining it so that it's not that explosive.
Right.
And based on what you said, it makes a lot of sense why you don't want to indulge in it at that high frequency because, it could explode. I actually had a colleague, he was a trained percussionist at Berkeley. And, him being a Bawalao, we're always trying to, corroborate Ifa, confirm Ifa, see how it kind of, has expressed itself into culture and different aspects of
Mhm.
academics. And he took an elective where it was drum therapy. And they used Native American drums. The person is surrounded by the drums laying on the floor. And, he said it was one of the most intense things he's ever been through. And then you look at the bata drum and seeing the low frequencies that are there, the very tribal, the very indigenous energy that's there. A lot of people would liken the same thing. Have you seen this phenomena with the drums, possibly, or music? Having that therapeutic, spiritual, positive effect.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've studied other groups of people besides just, Ifa and Santeria. So yes, definitely Native American, even like people in South Africa, they do use drumming or chanting or some kind of sensory stimulation, usually via sound. So absolutely, and I mean, I've witnessed it myself, right? I mean, sitting in on a misa espiritual or sitting in a tambor, you do start to feel a little lightheaded and a little bit woozy, almost like a little tipsy when those drums start to play. So yeah, I mean, I've experienced it firsthand. I think I don't know of anybody who has sat through an experience like that and doesn't feel the energy in the room from that music.
Yeah, it's and they say that bata and percussion itself actually developed from the observation of the heartbeat by, ancient man. That's where percussion really, that rhythm, that constant movement that we're in, even when we're not actively trying to do it, is to resemble that music to give us that benefit. When you look at Ifa, there's so many stories, and there's a really specific one that I've always enjoyed since I've heard it. It speaks of when Ogun actually went through therapy, right? And in this sign, Ogun had anger issues, right? Where he was very frustrated with mankind because he felt that they were unappreciative, or they weren't appreciating the opportunity that they had to delve into the benefits of Ifa. And it would cause him to actually commit homicide. It's a pretty intense bataki.
Wow.
And immediately, people wanted him executed because they're like, no one's going to be able to control this man. He's monstrous, in his physique, and coupled with that anger, he's a serious threat to, everyone's safety. But 𝗀𝗲𝗍𝗲, being the personification of patience and logic, he said, let me have a round with this guy, where the 𝗵𝗲𝗹𝗁 actually occupied that psychological, role in ancient times. And he sat down with Ogun. He performed divination where the 𝗿𝗲𝗹𝗁 was revealed, or 𝗿𝗲𝗹𝗁. And he was able to identify that, Ogun had some spiritual undertones to what he was going through, but the most important thing was he wasn't being allowed to express himself, or he felt like he wasn't being understood. When Ogun began doing this with 𝗀𝗲𝗍𝗲, he felt the benefits, and 𝗀𝗲𝗍 said, for every person you think you're going to kill, please throw a knife at the wall, right? After going 3 months, 6 months, a full year of rotation, Ogun felt completely rehabilitated. He still had to suffer the consequences of his actions. He was going through his legal process, but he was able to interact with people without resorting to violence. And when he looked at the wall and he saw all the knives, he realized, how important it was to get in touch with that aspect of himself for the benefit of the public, the community, like you've mentioned. What benefits do you think spiritually infused therapy, or even these kind of, esoteric practices can have on human beings who are going through this kind of frustration, maybe?
Well, so it's interesting because I was gonna say, I mean, look, if a person feels that what they're experiencing is spiritual, invalidating their experience, that's gonna cut the therapeutic process. It's gonna stop it completely. So recognizing, you mentioned about the pataki. Another person that I interviewed for my dissertation, he also mentioned the pataki to me. And if I correct me if I'm mistaken of the story, but that Yemaya, her when she lost a child and she was like overtaken or overcome or possessed by the spirit of grief. If the
Absolutely.
patient so if the patient is grieving and says, I'm being possessed by a spirit of death or of grief, that is how they are trying to conceptualize their pain. Who am I to take that away from them and tell them, no, you need to look at things from my clinical perspective? It's my job as the clinician to adjust and accommodate them, not the other way around. So if them looking at the world from that framework and me working with that framework to help them process what they're going through, that can only be beneficial. Because even in the case with what Orunla recommended to Ogun there, clinically that would be considered like gestalt therapy or psychodrama to act out that pain in some other way. But again, it needed to be presented to him in a spiritual framework because he felt that it was something spiritual. So again, if we can learn to work with the patient, not invalidate their experience, rather try to embrace it. But again, that requires more work on our part, and I think that that's part of the issue here. There's a lot of ego in this profession. People rather the patient adjust to us than us be of service to them. But that's a problem within our profession that needs help, needs some work.
I sincerely believe that in any profession where you're providing a service, you have to have 3 Ps, right? Patience, persistence, and positivity. Because if you don't incorporate those things, and also passion, I'll throw another P in there as well, because that's the only thing that's going to motivate you to really look into what neurological pathway do I have to go down with this individual, for them to understand that we're working towards the same goal and getting there, because that's huge. My therapist doesn't understand what I'm going through. You know, if these are the terms that the patient is able to express them in, we have to understand, based on our training, what are they really trying to relate. And it seems like you've been able to accomplish that. And you know, like in anything, others may have not, because they might be lacking one of those P's that I mentioned, right? But yeah.
Yeah, because like I said, I have had patients who come in and I'm like, I don't know anything about what this person is going through. I have no idea about their religion. I had a patient once come in who practiced voodoo. I don't know anything about voodoo. So, I contacted a hooligan and I told him, look, I'm a
Nice.
psychotherapist. I have a patient who practices this religion. I don't know anything about this religion. I need to get a little bit of a better understanding about what this person's cultural and spiritual framework is, because I need to be able to communicate with him on the same level. But I don't know of too many psychotherapists that are willing to go that length of consulting with a spiritual advisor and educating themselves, learning, because otherwise we're not going to be able to help our patients if we don't understand what they're going through, what their perspectives are.
Absolutely. And you know, before I really open up the the stage really, for, because I know you humbled me a year ago by offering to interview and ask me questions as you were going through your academic process. And the whole time I'm like, as soon as I get some decent visuals, I'm going to reach out to this person. And luckily, by way of Mr. Phil, we've been able to accomplish that. But before we delve into the things that you wanted to get into on this end, I wanted to touch on the concept of ori, right?
Mhm.
Ori, it does mean head. When we translate it, it also means I see, because it makes reference to, the eye chakra, being able
Mhm.
to, visualize spiritually. But ultimately, Ori is the extension of a supreme being within us that makes creation possible. It is the emanation of 𝗀𝗲𝗻𝗁, or our supreme creator, imparting that inheritance upon us to be able to create positivity and effect. It's destiny, right? Because every human being is destined to occupy that divine role, to give back and to create something better for those around us. Now, within the academic, medical, psychological field, is there anything resemblant to that concept, or even within our brain, or the feeling of right, maybe?
So I have to say that this is probably one of the most challenging things that I encountered while doing my dissertation, is because, at least based on the research that I did, I could not find any equivalent to what the
Oh,
Ori represents in Western thought. The way that I presented it in my dissertation is that it's interesting. It's a metaphysical organ, right? Because you're right. It's the physical head, it's the scalp, it's the brain, but it's so much more than that. It exists both on the physical and on the spiritual. My interpretation of it, again, from like a psychological perspective, it's that it's the portal or an antenna. It's what connects the personal consciousness, the personality, the ego, to that akashic field, to the collective unconscious, to the spirituality. It's I guess that's the best way that I would say it. It's like there's a portal there. As far as an organ is concerned, I'm hesitant to say the pineal gland, but research seems to be leaning in that direction, that possibly this is an organ that produces an endogenous chemical, DMT, that has the ability to transport you to these states. So if I had to pinpoint it to a specific physical organ, I would possibly say possibly, because we don't know for certain, but research is leaning in that direction of possibly the pineal gland.
and really interesting organ, because you've mentioned it repeatedly, and it kind of has to do with all those different things. Um, and then once again, you look at this ancient concept of, like you said, the closer we go to creation, the more in touch we are with who we were. Um, all of these things seem to resonate with each other. And it also, in my opinion, what really made me fall in love with African theology was just how precise it was. It was spiritual science. And that's what Ifa really is to me. I remember when I got initiated as a Babalawo, my Oyu Bona, who I considered a very enlightened man, he told me Ifa is the only thing in harmony with music and science, or music and mathematics. It's harmonious, but it's precise. There's poetry, but there's binary code, but there's sequence. And it blew my mind, to the point where that conversation has stuck with me even 8 years later now, this December 23rd, or 7 years, forgive me. So these people, they were enlightened. You know, there's so many technologies that, you know, we still don't even know how the pyramids were fully constructed. You know, how are these people moving 300 ton blocks? You know, there's even theories now of like telepathy, telekinesis. You know, maybe the pineal gland had all the things to do with that, but it's laying so dormant now. We're trying to re-stimulate it. You know.
Well, and they say that the pineal gland is also considered like the physical third eye. If it's supposed to be directly behind your forehead, and it's about the size of an eye. The other
Where is
interesting
it,
thing.
ma'am?
So, say that again.
Where is it? Forgive me. Where is this located? The gland, the pineal.
Inside the brain, if straight, all like where your third eye is, all the way back into the center of the brain.
Oh
Um,
wow.
So interesting thing, it's not something that is very well understood as far as the DMT component, but we do know that the pineal gland controls the circadian rhythm, right? Your sleep cycle. So even if your eyes or your forehead area is exposed to light, it's not going to produce melatonin, which is the sleep hormone to help you to fall asleep. Sleep also seems to be a big part of, again, entering into trance states or sliding over into the unconscious, entering into spiritual states. So right now, that the study of the pineal gland, I think, is the closest that we're going to get to understanding on a Western psychological perspective to what the Ori is on a physical level or on a psychological level.
That's incredible. And you know, when you look at most Afro-Indigenous faiths, the whole focus of the spiritualities is the head. It is the gateway to the divine. It is the gateway to that deep, profound thought, that creative molecule. Um, Really fascinating stuff. You know, I open up the stage to you, Dr. Rojas, as well, because, you know, I recall you had some wonderful questions when we were going to originally do this. You're more than welcome to express them now. I'd be more than delighted.
Oh, I mean, I don't have the questions in front of me at the moment, but I would love to ask the questions even though the research study is done just because the some of the interviews that I did conduct, I did publish them with the permission of the participants and the public seemed to really enjoy it. I would love to recreate this study again, with more specifically with Babalaos or even other religions, because another religion that I would like to maybe explore a little bit further is like Balo. So, yeah, I would definitely love to conduct that interview once I'm a little bit more prepared with the
No,
questions.
absolutely, and you know we've touched so many fabulous things up until this point. Also, wanted to take a moment to really compliment your office as well. I see that beautiful 𝘃cie depiction in the back, and like we were saying before we started recording, so inviting for people. You know, whether it's the Asian depictions or you know just so many elements that are really inviting. I mean, how has the response been to creating a space like that that is spiritually influenced within your workspace?
So it's interesting. People who have looked me up online, I guess they've already seen a picture of the office and they know what to expect. And a lot of times they'll tell me, "Oh, the office is what convinced me to come and see you because this seems like this is different from anybody else I've ever come to see." For people who don't find me through my website, I guess the first thing when they walk in, they're always a little bit shocked with all the colors. But I always explain to them, I go, "Look, I've been to psychotherapy before, and going into like a dreary office with like grays and beiges." It's very depressing. When you come in here, I want you to feel, psychologically stimulating. I want you to think. I want you to find our process as a creative process, as a collaborative process. And I don't think that's going to happen being surrounded by gray and beige colors. But with turmeric and teal and eschew and all my other, I got Ganesha back there. I have everybody. I even have some Native American figures. I got a little bit of everything to represent all the different. Again, this idea that different religions, different cultures, but we're all coming from the same source.
Well, when you look at that concept of color, like you said, and I'm not sure the effect it could have on the mind or on the brain, but the Orishas are seen as nothing more than wavelengths of light, right? When we look at the energy that is identified with Shango, right? Ultraviolet, very red, very
Mhm.
hot, seemingly masculine and characteristic. And that's what ultimately manifested as the concept of Shango. When we look at the wavelength associated with Oshun, yellow light, you know, very soft, very maternal, very receptive, and that ultimately manifested as her concept as well. The Orishas are nothing more than energy. So to be able to tap into Orisha, which literally means selected head or guardian
Mhm.
of the head, We have to be able to open up those pathways, and the absence of color and the absence of vibrancy is definitely not going to create that space. So very, very illuminated on your behalf. So many odus that speak about it. I have a question for you. What would you say to other psychotherapists, professionals in your field who are very resistant to incorporating these kind of elements in their practice for the benefit of their patients?
Well, so people who are resistant to it because they think that religion or spirituality is just like foolishness, try to look at it from the perspective again how Jung presents it, as far as like this is all archetypes within the unconscious. They're symbols. Whether you choose to see the Orishas as supernatural beings or as archetypes and pieces of ourselves, of our humanity, it makes no difference. But again, if we can work directly with these really core elements of our psyche, because remember that the psyche doesn't really communicate in language like spoken word. It communicates in symbols. When you dream, it's always very cryptic, it's symbolic, it's archetypal. So the sooner you learn to embrace that and work with, again, the language of the unconscious, the more receptive and the more powerful your therapy is going to be. Because I'm telling you, I mean, I use psychodynamic and Jungian psychotherapy, and it's extremely effective because it goes straight to the source, straight to, again, reaching into the unconscious, embracing these archetypal figures and these archetypal stories. And religion is an outpouring of that. This is how human beings express these elements.
No, that's incredible. You mentioned the symbolic dynamic within the practice, because when you look at African or indigenous based faith, like the existentialism of having an image, having an icon, using that to be able to resonate with yourself, being able to heal by way of another object, and it's incredible that you say that, because that's literally what the indigenous based faiths are constructed upon. Now, what would you say to those patients out there that really feel like they're going through a spiritually induced or influenced situation, but they're not really having that luck in finding someone such as yourself? Even though we're gonna have your all your contact information as well, you know what I'm saying?
Okay.
So now they'll have that option. But for those up until this point who haven't and feel lost or feel like they're untreatable, what can you say to them to kind of help them have that hope?
So I'll give you some clues. As far as finding a therapist who's going to be open to that, you want to look for certain keywords. Transpersonal would definitely be a big one, because again, that if a person uses that term, it means that they're open to the idea of spirituality. Jungian or Jungian psychology. That's another branch of psychology that's going to be a lot more open. Uh, they're hard to find. I'm not gonna lie, because I know a lot of my practice right now is fully booked, because as far as I'm aware, I'm the only Jungian here in South Florida, or in the
Nice,
Coral Gables area.
nice.
Um, if you're not able to find a psychologist, I mean, then try to start off where you can find help. As far as a spiritual leader, there's always people out there to help. It's just a matter of finding the right terms to be able to start looking for somebody. Because, like you said, you mentioned that there's times where Babalaos will say, "Look, this is not spiritual. This is more emotional. Go find." Maybe through the community they might have a better luck. But I have a feeling if you look specifically for those key terms, it's going to increase your likelihood of finding the right kind of therapist that's going to be open to these kind of ideas.
As somebody that has literally dedicated their life to this philosophy, this practice, I really commend you for having the courage and the transparency to be able to carry our flag and show, hey, this is what I'm a part of. This is what has helped me. It's going to provide such volumes for our community to be considered and be acknowledged, especially with your level of academic achievement. How has Ifa and Orisha benefited you personally?
Oh gosh, I mean, it's interesting because while I think that psychotherapy is extremely useful and helpful, I often find myself leaning more towards my spiritual community than I do seeking out a psychotherapist, just because within the faith there, I think that the sense of community is extremely helpful. That's one. There's less judgment when you're going through some kind of experience. There's always a sense of trying to find meaning, because even like through the stories of the pataquis, it's helpful to hear, even if again, if it's through talking about the experiences of an Orisha or whoever, it gives you a sense of meaning and purpose to your suffering, to your experiences. For me personally, I would say the sense of community, that knowing that no matter what I'm going through, I have people to turn to and people who understand my experiences. I don't have to be embarrassed or ashamed because, kind of like we were talking before. I mean, unless you're born into this faith, talking about these kind of things is very taboo.
Oh yes.
So having a space where no judgment, there's family, it's community. That's always very helpful.
Well, I tell you, it's funny you mentioned the conversational aspect of things because, forgive me, I have a couple of 𝗷𝗸𝗍𝗍 that I have in a WhatsApp chat and whatnot, and out of nowhere, we'll get these random texts like, "Hey, I'm doing this today, this, and this." I said, if anybody else was to read this, they think we were absolutely mad. It's a wild job. There's not much of a schedule, and if you know, you know. I call it, we're like the Hogwarts of the world. I think at this moment, but if you want in, you're more than welcome. And Dr. Rojas, you are an asset to the community and all the people who interact with you on a level of patient professional. And to bring things full circle, what's next for you? What are those plans? Do we have any more studies coming up? Anything other than this pending interview that we have now?
So right now, thanks to my mentor, Dr. 𝗃𝗗𝗿𝗂, I'll have to say, shout out to her for supporting me throughout this whole process.
Yes.
She was really pushing for me once I completed the dissertation to publish a book with the same material because she mentioned, academic studies can be very difficult it's at least difficult to access for people outside of academia, just because the language is very technical. So trying to get that information out there in a way that's more accessible for somebody who just needs to pick up a book, through certain chapters and not go through like a whole study about the methodology and all that the technical scientific stuff. So that's one thing that I would like to publish hopefully by next year. Something else that I'm also actively working on is to try to publish more case studies on patients that I have worked with that using again this side by side psychotherapy and spiritual intervention, showing the outcomes of to show the benefits of that. Because unfortunately, unless research gets published and is peer reviewed, the scientific community is not going to respect this information. There's a lot of books out there, but again, unless there's like rigorously vetted by other scientists, it's just not going to make an impact. So I'm in a privileged position where I'm like, okay, I have my titles, I have the opportunity to present data, to have it peer reviewed, and hopefully add more legitimacy to this idea of like, hey, this is something we should be paying attention to. This is important. This is going to help patients, help humanity at whole. So really, right now, the things to look out for, as far as I'm concerned, is a book. Hopefully by next year, I'll have it completed, and a couple case studies that I'm working on based on patients that I'm working with currently.
Very exciting things, and based on what you've been able to accomplish up until this point, I'm sure that's going to be quite achievable.
Thank
Um,
you.
Really fabulous interaction once again. As a practitioner, thank you so much for being a beacon within your community. Medically for us, and such a wonderful representant. And on behalf of all of us, thank you, and our Roots podcast thanks you as well. And hopefully, the first of many conversations. It was wonderful.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Rojas.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Well, family, a couple things I want to mention before we disconnect. Consultations are available at 𝗏𝗏𝗍𝗏andmore.com or by contacting 407-440-2086. If you're in the Coral Gables, Miami-Dade County area and you're interested in Dr. Rojas' services, her credentials and contact information will be present to receive all the benefits from her treatment. As well as our website is up and running. If you're interested in Ifa courses of any kind, you want to become a better Ifa professional, we're here to serve. All of those are available to you. Please like the video, share the video, comment on the video, and from Our Roots podcast, until next time, see the light.